First of all, I just wanted to welcome everyone to this Arts First podcast, the podcast dedicated freedom of expression and arts for art's sake. I'm Wendy Earle, and my co-host and technical supremo is Niall Crowley. Today, we're focusing on Shakespeare. When preparing for this podcast, I suddenly had a memory, my earliest memory of Shakespeare, as a 6-year-old girl in Ghana, post-independence. My mother played Lady Macbeth in a fundraising amateur dramatics production in Ho, a small town in southern Ghana. Her Macbeth was the local Ghanaian chief of police. And by all accounts, it was a raging success. So I have to say, all accounts is my parents' account. And when my family returned to England, Shakespeare always remained a real part of our cultural life. And it's continued to be a key reference point for my life, I think, although I neglect him often. So I'm really delighted to be hosting this episode about why he has remained a star in the literary firmament for over 400 years. And I'm especially delighted that Andrew Doyle has agreed to kick off the discussion. Andrew, as you may know, is a successful comedian. His parody woke character Titania McGrath has been a huge success, and he hosts my favourite GB news programme, Free Speech Nation. Overall, he's an astute political commentator and a beacon of courage and humour in a bleak cultural wars landscape. But most of all, for the purposes of this podcast, he's passionate about Shakespeare. I heard him speak eloquently on the subject this summer and immediately wanted him to come on the podcast. Now, this is a short podcast and there's a lot to say, so we're going to focus on what lies at the heart of Shakespeare's genius. And I've asked Andrew to kick off with this question. And after he's talked for a little while, I've invited 3 of my friends, all Shakespeare enthusiasts, to respond. Jane Sandeman, Chief Operating Officer at the Passage Charity for Homeless People, Alka Sehgal-Cuthbert, Director of Don't Divide Us, and Richard Woolfenden, English teacher and filmmaker. So, Andrew, what do you think lies behind Shakespeare's abiding genius? How come his plays have continued to entertain us for over 400 years since they were first produced?
Well, it's such a big question. Thank you, though, for having me on to attempt to answer it. I think the first thing to say is that we ultimately know which artists I think the most significant by what we call the canon of English literature. And I think there's a big misunderstanding about how the canon is formed. And there's this sense that there are academics in ivory towers who sort of decide which texts are the ones that we need to study. And in some cases, that is, of course, true. But truly, the truly canonical works, as far as I can see, are those that have been most imitated by other artists. Those are the ones that really make the decisions. So the texts that are the most influential. Now, when it comes to Shakespeare, he has been hugely imitated, as you know, never bettered. That, to me, is a very, very interesting thing. The idea that he started his career at the onset of the public theatres that had only been around for a few decades when he arrived in London, roughly 1587. And this was a relatively new medium. At the same time, you have the university wits, a group of playwrights who are bringing into the theatre, elevating it beyond the level of doggerel, making it something that is literary, because, of course, at the time, the theatre was considered a kind of low form of art. So he's arrived at just the right time. And his influence is absolutely palpable. It's palpable at the time, the degree of influence on other writers who existed, the degree of resentment that he generated amongst his peers. That tells us quite a lot as well. And then we know that Shakespeare is important. I mean, in his lifetime, he's important. He manages to become a gentleman, which was a lifelong ambition. Ultimately, 2 of his colleagues produce a folio of his complete works, or as near as damn it to his complete works, which was an unprecedented thing to do. I mean, you had Ben Jonson's folio in 1616, but he did that himself. He was quite a snobbish, sort of arrogant type of person. So that, that tells us a lot about the regard in which he is held. And actually, if you look at the text of the folio and you read the various elegies in praise of Shakespeare, you can see, even from Ben Jonson says he's not of an age, but for all time. Ben Jonson was not just a friend, but a really bitter rival as well. So if he can bring himself to say that, it tells us quite a lot. But then after that, when the theatres are finally closed down, when the Puritans seize power in Parliament in 1642, and the theatre there's a gap. There's a few decades where there is no theatre, no new plays are being written. And after the Restoration, when plays are back on again, it's Shakespeare that really catches on. I mean, they're obviously dragging up all these old plays to try and entertain people, but it's Shakespeare that the call is for more Shakespeare. So it doesn't happen by accident. I think there's a sense that people assume we pick on Shakespeare because for some sort of freak accident of history, he just caught on when others didn't. In other words, that it was more about fashion than anything else. And that's actually not true at all. The closest I think that comes to his standard at the time is Christopher Marlowe, but of course Marlowe died in 1593 and wasn't able to reach the heights that Shakespeare ultimately did with those great tragedies in the last 15 years of his life. So I would say that's the reason. That's how we know. And even today, the fact that he is so imitated and so sought after by artists and people who are making theatre themselves, that's how we know how it resonates. But also, there isn't really anyone else who did what he did to the genre of the theatre. You know, he's made fundamental changes to the entire medium in a way that only a genius can. I mean, I suppose a closer comparison would be Aeschylus, who effectively invents the concept of theatrical tragedy, you know, invents the idea of dialogue. I mean, brings these things out of nothing. That is obviously a sign of great genius. Of course, we've lost most of Aeschylus's work. But with Shakespeare, he takes what Marlowe had sort of created, this sort of bombastic blank verse, and does something and improves upon it. But what he also does is, for the first time, I think, in theatre, is to bring in a genuine psychological insight into the characterizations. Each character seems to live and breathe. Each character seems to think for itself, his or herself. Even the minor characters seem to have a life of their own. I mean, if you take in Love's Labour's Lost, when Jacquinetta comes on for one scene, this is the woman who Don Amado claims to be in love with. One scene, you know everything about her. I can tell you who she is from just those 5 or 6 lines that she has. It's quite astonishing. The way that he revolutionized the soliloquy, so that, you know, before then, take a Marlovian soliloquy like the Duke of Guise in Massacre at Paris, you have an evil character telling you his plot, telling you what he wants and why. When you get to Shakespeare, when you get to Macbeth's soliloquies or Hamlet's soliloquies, you have someone wrestling with their own conscience. You have someone who is trying to figure out their thought process as they go along, and most crucially, is able to reveal elements of themselves to the audience that they themselves do not even know. When Iago soliloquizes, he doesn't realize that he's lying to himself. This is quite an astonishing, the idea that a writer could inhabit so many different types of human being and see the world from all perspectives is one of the reasons why, firstly, he's so adaptable, and why people keep coming back to him, because anyone can find anything of themselves within Shakespeare, and anyone can use Shakespeare to promote or bolster their own worldview, right? You can twist it in any way. This is why when there was a famous production of Coriolanus in France in the 1930s, you had people from both sides of the debate. You had Republicans and communists coming along, finding their own message within the play, because the play doesn't have a message, because he didn't write morality plays. What he writes, you know, I think in that lecture you mentioned, I quoted A.L. Rowse because he put it really perfectly. A.L. Rowse said that Shakespeare saw through everyone equally, and I think that's exactly what it is. You can't read him for a message. We don't know anything that he thought about anything political or religious or whatever. We just don't know. And the reason we don't know is because he seems to offer every single potential perspective in human life. And the sheer abundance of that, the sheer breadth of the characterizations he's able to produce hasn't been bettered. I can't think of a single author, let alone playwright, who has come close to that. And I think that's why he has persisted, and why he will always persist, so long as certain ideological groups don't get their way and reduce everything to the notion of group identity and suggest that as a white male, he needs to be consigned to oblivion.
Thank you. Yes, that's really useful. I've got lots of questions myself, but I'd like to, Alka, you're unmuted already. So would you like to say something?
Yes, just listening to you then, Andrew, and also making my way through the lovely Jonathan Bate book as well on Shakespeare. I think for me, the biggest gift, the wonder of Shakespeare, is his ability to remove himself and give himself over to his art. And the other part of that is, the other thing that makes Shakespeare great is us, because it's in the connection of us with his work that we're offered a kind of imaginative plane on which to think of ourselves, imagine ourselves on a far greater, deeper scope than ordinary everyday life allows. And that's, I think, the wonder and marvel of Shakespeare. I'll leave it at that for now. There's loads more I could say about the actual plays and the language, which can just be absolutely fantastic and sublime.
Richard.
I thought that was an excellent point by Andrew, followed up by Alka. I think it's a really interesting area to unpick, this nature of openness, complete openness, and the frustration that people have in wanting to pin him down, to have a particular kind of a worldview, and yet it's not forthcoming because all kinds of worldviews are there and evident. as an English teacher, we have to mark our Shakespeare essays from our students more highly if they recognize author's intention. But that becomes quite difficult with Shakespeare because you can get quite clunky. Well, Shakespeare created Macbeth because he wanted to show that regicide was a bad thing. Okay, well, yeah, that's quite straightforward. It's not easy because, yes, we do know some biographical information about him, but unlike studying something like Inspector Calls, we don't have reams of his own commentary on his own plays. He's in the background. And I think I keep on coming back to a text I study with my A-level students, Hamlet, and there's Act 2, Scene 2, which is a mammoth scene where he's trying to unpick Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and find out if they're really been sent by Claudius to spy on him. And he finds that out, and he gets Guildenstern to say, yes, we were sent for. And then he goes into this prose-based soliloquy with tons of rhythm and poetry, but I call it the quintessence of dust monologue. But what you may know it for is, what a piece of work is a man. All these brilliant things, but man delights me not. And I think that goes to the heart of what Shakespeare's about, is that he's fascinated with the actual living, breathing nature of humanity. And he wants to show it from all kinds of angles and in its psychological complexity. So I really want to explore that more about the nature of openness. I think it's a really interesting point.
Yeah. Jane?
All three have been brilliant, so I don't know what to add. But I guess I think the thing about Shakespeare is that he is thinking and describing and trying to understand what becoming human is when people are starting to become human, if that makes sense, in the real modern way and in the real complex way that people are becoming human, an interior dialogue, a public and a private. So he is exactly at that point when those ideas and that way of thinking is first coming into being. And I know it's a bit of a cliche, but we are human because Shakespeare exists. You watch Hamlet and you can actually see that burst of humanity onto the stage, the first time that humanity is really thinking about itself internally, as you say, the complexity of others, the understanding of others. So you're moving away from that medieval time in which people are seen in their rotes rather than them as people. That classic people, that bloke who comes back from the wars in a man on, and no one recognizes that he's a different person because there wasn't that sense of individuality. And it's just at that time of, Elizabethan time, is that idea that people are individuals, they are operating a different sphere, they're operating differently to how you are operating. And so Shakespeare is the birth of that, and we are a part of that birth. And so I think that continually happens, doesn't it? And he continues to surprise you. And I always think I know Shakespeare's plays, and then you go to a Shakespeare play and you think, I've completely forgotten that, or I completely didn't see that before. And so you're always looking through the corner of a door or the edge of your eye, and he continually makes you do that.
Yeah, just relating to those questions, so I suppose taking it in a slightly different direction, which you can feel free to ignore. I wonder how much, like, his own sense of history in the past he was building on, if you know what I mean. Like, one of the concerns today is the sense of loss of history. And yet the depth of Shakespeare seems to be very much in the way he draws on so much from the past and sort of, like, in a way uses sources from the past as a way of exploring the present. So I don't know if that's something that was new in Shakespeare time or evolving, that sense of history, and then Shakespeare kind of synthesized it in some way in his sense of the humanity of history. Alka, yeah.
I think I want to take issue with that a little bit. I don't know, I'm not a biographer of Shakespeare. I don't know his intentions in that way, but I doubt that he was trying to synthesize history, although he obviously drew inspiration from historical sources. But I think what excited him was probably fueled him was the extent to which he must have been so tapped into the contemporary intellectual currents of his time. We know that he was educated, and this was a period I mean, Jane referenced about, the, if you like, the emergence of the individual, but that was alongside great theological and philosophical discussions about the nature of man in nature, the state of nature, what civilization was. Just think of a play like The Tempest. I mean, probably the idea of a shipwreck might be quite a common motif in plays of that era. I'm not sure. Maybe Andy, you might know, but it seems to me quite a powerful trope to use artistically to look at some of those questions that were being discussed in a more kind of logical way amongst philosophers and theologians. So I doubt that he was trying to synthesize history deliberately into art, although I think he obviously drew inspiration for some of his plays.
I think you expressed it best. I didn't mean synthesize history. I felt more what you were saying about his work comes out of its historical background. Anyway, Andrew.
Well, my feeling about that is that I don't think he was very interested in plot lines. I think he was a magpie who would take the plots wherever he could get them from. It's interesting to mention The Tempest, because that's one of the few plays which has an original plot. The others are Midsummer Night's Dream and Love's Labour's Lost. But he plundered history as much as he plundered other people's works to sort of explore the ideas that he wanted to explore. It's very interesting that, when he arrives in London at that high point of patriotism in the war against Imperial Spain, just a year or two before the Armada, he can tap into, notice his history cycle from the early part of his career. So he is drawing on English history. And also, this is around the same time when the second edition of Ralph Holinshed's Chronicles are published, which is a precise text that he used to gather this historical information to create his plots. But what he doesn't do is just sort of systematically repeat the facts of history or dramatize the facts of history, because, again, he's interested in what the circumstances of history produce psychologically and individually. So he doesn't have Richard II as a king who is deposed. He has Richard II reflecting on the idea that he's actually a man, but he's meant to embody the body politic. He does something far more interesting than just retelling of history. I imagine he was, to an extent, capitalizing on that patriotism that was sort of existing at the time, just as a play like Macbeth could be said to be capitalizing on the fact that we have a new Scottish king in the capital, and therefore, this is a play obviously about a Scottish king, which also draws on witchcraft, which is something that James I was obsessed with. So he's perfectly willing to, I suppose, opportunistically adapt things, but he's doing it ultimately to get to this, what I was trying to talk about, which is this sort of psychological perception of humanity, which is timeless, which is cross-cultural, which is why he can't just be located within the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, which is why the ways in which the characters behave, react, reflect, resonates with us, because human beings haven't changed and human dilemmas and politics hasn't changed. All of that remains continual. The other thing I just wanted to come back on is the point that was made about how Shakespeare continually surprises us, which is what Jane was saying, that you're constantly coming back to it and finding things you didn't see before. And one of the things that I think, again, elevates him above most artists is that he isn't writing to pander to anyone. And there's always a sense in which he's testing the limits of your tolerance or taking you in directions that you maybe don't even want to go. So there's loads of examples of this. But if you take King Lear, again, he takes an existing story, a well-known story. And what we expect to happen, we think the play is going to finish in Act 4 when Cordelia is reunited with Lear, and that should be the perfect ending, but he doesn't do that. He takes you further, and he has her hanged. And this is something that isn't in the source text. He introduces that. It's the reason why Dr. Johnson hated it so much and preferred the rewritten Nahum Tate version, because he said there was no poetic justice there. It is an unbearable watch. And he's doing that deliberately. And he, even within his own time frame, he's not adhering to notions of genre. He's not adhering to the Aristotelian principles of unity of time, place, and action, with perhaps the exception of Comedy of Errors. He's playing with genre all the time. I mean, if a play like Cymbeline, what is that? I mean, it's called a tragedy in the folio, but isn't it also a comedy? Isn't it also a pastoral? Is Julius Caesar a history, or is it a tragedy? Even something like Twelfth Night, where you think this is a romp, this is a standard comedy which will end in marriage and everything is fine. But does it? I mean, their treatment of Malvolio is outright cruel to an extent that it leaves a very bitter taste in the audience's mouths. It's something that we're not comfortable with at the end. And when he leaves saying, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you," I'm sort of on his side. I know he's a prig, and I know we're not meant to like him, but I think he has a point. And it's unpleasant. It's deeply unpleasant. It's a dark thread that runs through a comedy. I mean, even something like Comedy of Errors, which is full on Plautus style farce, really. It opens with a really bleak scene. A man's going to be put to death, and he has to find the money to pay for his own life. So he's not satisfied with taking things in the way that you would think they would take. And the example that was given there by Richard of Hamlet is a very good one. You know, the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern interrogation is fascinating, but not least because ultimately what Hamlet does to them, the fact that he engineers their deaths, is needless. There's no need for it. And you could say, well, Hamlet is someone that we can all associate with, and we can feel that we're at one with him. But we wouldn't do that, would we? He's a very deeply morally ambiguous figure. He's also a philosopher thrown into a revenge tragedy, which again is not something that anyone else was doing. I mean, Senecan revenge tragedies were really popular at the time. And you had things like Thomas Kyd's The Spanish Tragedy, and you had an earlier version of Hamlet. But this is new. This idea of putting a philosopher student in the role of revenger where he does not belong, and he simply doesn't belong, and it doesn't make sense for him to be there. And Shakespeare makes this absolutely clear by introducing revengers who are capable of the job. People like Laertes, who, as soon as he discovers that his father has been killed, and then his sister has committed suicide, probably, then he doesn't care. He even says he doesn't mind if he's damned. He's going to pursue the revenge. Then you've got Fortinbras, who is, going to retake the land that was lost in the wars. He's a man of action, and Hamlet is not a man of action. And the sheer sort of revolutionary concept of bringing in a character who does not belong in that play, and yet the play works so well and becomes the most famous play of all time. I mean, it tells you something, doesn't it? It's endlessly surprising. That's a play that you can read throughout your life, and I don't think you'd ever fully grasp it.
Richard, did you want to come back on any of that?
Oh, there's just so much there. I suppose the other thing that I'm interested in around the whole openness theme that Andrew introduced is also just the way that he was perceived by his detractors and competitors, and the whole way that almost ever since the university wits had something against him, and as he emerged in the London scene, people found him hard to pin down, and there became almost an authorial discussion and debate about whether he could actually even write his own plays from the moment that he appeared on the scene. I think that's fascinating and it continues right to this day, that actually partly because he has got his finger so much on the human condition, and he's not a moralist, he's not a university, it wasn't a university graduate, that this has led to a whole series of discussions about he can't possibly have written that material. And I find that an important discussion to engage with, because it's another way of approaching the whole question of genius that Andrew's quite rightly raised.
Isn't that interesting that what you were saying earlier about people desperate to pigeonhole him? All of the candidates that they put up for the potential real Shakespeare, they're all aristocrats. People like the Earl of Oxford or Francis Bacon. And, Bacon was a great essayist and prose stylist. He couldn't write poetry. The Earl of Oxford was dead, wasn't he, by early 1600s? Marlowe was dead in 1593. People say it might have been him. But people are desperate. And the people they draw in, figures who, frankly, couldn't have written it, didn't write it. And that, of all the conspiracy theories, I mean, talking moon landing, Paul McCartney dead, etc., this is the most absurd. Because if you want to claim that Shakespeare didn't write his own works, you have to explain why every single person he knew during his own lifetime on the theatre scene thought that he did, and said that he did. Why does Ben Jonson refer to him as the Swan of Avon? Ben Jonson, who would have, if there was a slight hint that there was a conspiracy afoot, would have made a big deal of it. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But what it does reveal, which is more interesting, I think, is what it reveals about us. The fact that we can't contemplate this level of genius. We can't contemplate someone who can give us this breadth of humanity. That's why people will always say it's got to be many, many writers. And although he did collaborate with a few, such as Fletcher and Middleton, this idea that he couldn't possibly, one man couldn't possibly have done this. People say that about genius a lot, but then sometimes it's just there. Mozart couldn't possibly do what Mozart did at the age of 5, but he did. And we find it unfathomable, don't we? So I do think that question of the authorship question, I mean, even the new book by Jodie Pico, I had a bit of a back and forth with her. You know, she, although it's a work of fiction and she can obviously say whatever she wants and it's fine, she does genuinely believe that she's got this conspiracy theory that Amelia Lanier was behind it, and this aristocratic woman, or at least not a woman who came from an aristocratic background, at least. Again, people are just desperate to kind of tear this icon down. And isn't that interesting that they were trying to do it when he was alive as well? You know, this is some people hate. There's a lot of resentment, but for great genius. A really good thing to watch for this is Amadeus, the film Amadeus, which I just think, obviously all fiction and nonsense, but it's a great exploration of that deep, bitter rivalry and jealousy, and the fact that great genius stirs our admiration, but it also stirs hate and resentment.
I was thinking of Jodie Pico because I heard her on the radio the other day, and apart from her exceedingly annoying voice, I was sort of listening to her, and at first my first reaction was, "Oh, goodness sake, shut up, woman! What are you talking about?" But actually, I thought, well, really, she doesn't know it, but she's just paid the biggest compliment. She's paid the biggest compliment. She thinks Shakespeare was a woman. That is testament to, you think of some of the speeches of women that he's given, and they are, you know, when you read Merchant of Venice, I identify with virtually every character in it. You know, with Shylock, with Portia, with probably not Jessica, who I think is a bit measly minded, but the fact that you can think it was an aristocrat that wrote it, or probably you know, it would have to be somebody that was literate and educated, but most importantly, it was somebody who just must have loved humanity and people so much that he could just literally give himself over, you know, to creating all these fantastic works, which, as you say, are universal. I wanted to show you, wanted to dig it out, but I've got a photo of sort of friends of my parents in India at some kind of their boarding school, and they're doing a play of Shakespeare. And we talk about blackface here, but they're all got painted white faces. They're doing one of the history plays. They've got the tin crown and white face, white makeup on, playing Shakespeare. He is absolutely foundational in a way that really comes, you know, the only equivalent would be something like the Bible in terms of our culture and society. If you think about just, you know, I'm just thinking of my own, just personally. There were two things I can say, whatever, you know, all the education I've had and everywhere I've gone, the two things that have stayed with me and allowed me to connect with the world I live in here. It's been reciting the Lord's Prayer every day in primary school. It didn't mean anything to me at the time, but just having to do it collectively meant that later on I was just kind of, it was a little key into a world of ideas. And then a bit later on was Shakespeare, even though you didn't fully understand it at the time. And that's why I think people that say, oh, you shouldn't teach Shakespeare to kids because they won't understand it, I don't think that's right or true at all. I think it can be made understandable. And even if they don't understand it, it doesn't matter, because you're giving them a key for a future windows and doors. I mean, words fail me.
Jane?
You do think it is interesting that the aristocracy or the upper middle class are trying to claim someone who is so revolutionary, and so many of his plays are about how people are not kings. Well, they are kings, but they are also human. And, you know, Andrew, you talk about Lear, isn't it? When Lear realizes humanity, or even Richard III and how terrible he is. You know, there is not this adulation of kingship. And again, presumably they're just coming out of a static time, aren't they? And there would just be this very defined hierarchy. And here is the kings, here are the lords, here are the plebs. You know, anything that Shakespeare does is absolutely not accepting that hierarchical society. You know, you think even Macbeth, okay, he kills the king, and in the end he gets his comeuppance, but it's not because he kills the king. So even that is not direct. And I just wonder, is that because, I mean, remember when I used to work at the National Theatre, it used to sort of really drive me mad seeing the audiences, because you felt here's all these sort of upper middle class audience who are there because presumably they have to go there because they, you know, see Shakespeare. There's a certain civilized aspect to that, but you also felt, did they really understand the revolutionary nature of what Shakespeare was? So there seemed to be this really knowing their sort of attitudes and knowing, you know, the narrowness in some ways of how they were thinking. So is that why people are trying to reclaim Shakespeare for, put him into a much narrower box, perhaps.
That's probably quite a good moment to start looking to the question of good and bad productions. So, Andrew, I don't know if you want to respond to anything that has just been said, but if you also move on to the next sort of point, that would be good.
Yeah, I'm happy to move on. I mean, I've seen so many productions over the years, and most of them have been bad. And I know Hazlitt said that Shakespeare is better read than performed, and actually said that I think if I'm remembering rightly, he said specifically Hamlet works better as a read text. And there's a point to that insofar as, when you go and see a production, it is being mediated through someone else's eyes. So it is someone's interpretation of the text. I think there's validity to that in of itself. I'm quite interested to see someone else's view of what Hamlet is or what Macbeth is. I mean, that's great. I don't have a problem with that at all. But what did strike me, I mean, for a start, I think the productions that I've seen lately, and when I say lately, I mean the past 10 years, are very ideological, but all in one particular way. And I don't mind people using Shakespeare to promote a particular point of view if they want to. I mean, it's always been done. I mean, Laurence Olivier did it in his Henry V. So he had to cut out any elements of moral ambiguity in the character of Henry. When he kills the soldiers at Agincourt, he had to cut that out because it doesn't make sense if you're making a patriotic film that's funded during wartime by the government. There's all sorts of ways in which you can adapt and modify and it's that in itself is an artistic enterprise. And I want to be clear that I'm not saying I'm not a purist like that. I'm not saying there's only one way of doing Shakespeare and they should all be wearing tights or whatever. But what I would say is that it's getting quite dull now because everyone is doing it. Because the theatre industry is so captured by this identity obsessed monomania. And what is particularly banal about that is not just that everyone's doing it, but everyone's doing it and concurrently believing themselves to be radical for doing it, when in fact what they're doing is very much towing an establishment line. There's a big difference between having, as they have had recently at the Globe, a Cleopatra who is, I think it's with sign language rather than spoken, and Francis de la Tour playing Hamlet back in the 70s, which was a genuinely radical, unexpected thing to do. The modern identity focus, if you look at the Globe Theatre's website at the moment, all of the major Shakespeare productions feature black characters in the main roles. Well, that would have been really revolutionary a few decades ago. Now it's just expected. Now it's just, well, that's what we do now, isn't it? And it's drawing attention to and making Shakespeare all about group identity, race, sexual orientation, gender, whatever. And it's about every aspect of human life. And if you just narrow it, what you're effectively doing is making Shakespeare smaller. And it becomes very boring when every single production is pursuing the same ideological aim. It's like watching state propaganda, and you're also only seeing a tiny fragment of what Shakespeare is all about. I mean, certainly you could put on a production of Twelfth Night and focus on Antonio and Sebastian and make a point about same-sex relations, or Patroclus and Achilles in Troilus and Cressida and make a point about same-sex relations if you like. And that's valid and interesting. But when everything is about that, or if you just make Othello about race, well, the race of Othello's blackness isn't a major concern for most of the characters for most of the time. So you're only focusing on a tiny portion of what the play is all about. So I would like to see, when it comes to productions of Shakespeare, not the sort of purist best representation of it, or the cleanest representation of it, if you like, although those are valid too. Those are particularly useful as teaching tools. But I'd like to see more radical interpretations. I'd like to see people doing something different with Shakespeare, something unexpected with Shakespeare, because after all, Shakespeare did that himself. He was always, as I say, always being unexpected and surprising. If I go and see a production of Shakespeare and they've made it all about identity politics, well, I knew that was going to happen. That's boring. We know what the message is. And I have to say, I mean, I recently saw a production of Macbeth with Ralph Fiennes, and it was good. And it wasn't brilliant, but it was good. And the reason it was good actually was because they did so little to it. Because they used modern dress, they made it a modern war zone, but it was the text trimmed down as it invariably will be. But on the whole, it was just the text acted well by good actors, and the play is strong enough to sustain that. Like I say, not the best version of Macbeth, but certainly better than someone who wants to turn it into something about identity politics, which is just boring. So I think, at any point in history, when plays are solely dealing with the issues of their time, they are limiting themselves. Shakespeare doesn't respond well to that. Shakespeare is, you're better off using such material to talk about those trans-historical and cross-cultural features that he taps into.
I agree with a lot of that. I think that whenever I see a Shakespeare play that really catches me is its sense, it's the depth and breadth of the subjects he's talking about. Like you feel like you've seen something that really kind of taps into something that you can't even fully express. And then you get furious at the idea of Shakespeare turning it into a series of message making. I was talking earlier about the Royal Theatre, the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester. It's just had that complete disaster of cancelling a play that was talking about free Palestine and transgender politics or something in the middle of Midsummer Night's Dream. And it sounded absolutely awful, and they just shouldn't have allowed it to even develop. But then they cancelled it, and it sounded more like censorship. But it did sound appalling.
Well, I think they're claiming that it was to do with injuries on set and other issues. They're claiming they didn't cancel it because of the messaging. But like, again, if you want to do a production of Midsummer Night's Dream that's all about the Middle East and all about trans issues, you're free to do that. And I support anyone's artistic freedom to do it. But how banal? It's just banal. You know, it's not interesting or unexpected, or, you know, I don't agree with cancelling things like that, but I wouldn't choose to see that.
Richard, then Alka.
I'm going to throw a curveball into this. I broadly agree with Andrew's thesis. It makes me think that I actually need to go and see some more recent productions. I've seen a few. But if Shakespeare and his works are so open, and we're going through the time and the political time that we are, then there is a certain inevitability that one of the dominating trends of our time and sort of identity politics and wokeness will come through, and possibly it's limiting, it's narrowing. But I kind of therefore throw your idea back at you and say, is Shakespeare bigger than that? And that even if people try to box it in with identity politics and the rest of it, the play can still come through. And an extra question on that would be also, perhaps, are we looking at a certain crisis? And I don't know, because I don't know the theatrical scene well enough. Are we looking there for a crisis in real study and understanding of what Shakespeare's verse is about? So if you go and listen to the lectures and workshops that you can still get online with John Barton and the RSC team, and Peter Hall, the co-founders of the RSC, whatever you may think about their sort of political background in the 60s, and they were definitely inspired by everything that was coming alive in the 60s, their attention to detail about how to speak blank verse and how that filtered through the actors that we now see as national treasures like Judi Dench was incredible. And they came out of a group along with Trevor Nunn just after them, out of Cambridge, and they wanted to do something with Shakespeare, but they had an amazing understanding of actually how to speak it. And I was lucky to be able to see a lot of those earlier productions when I was very young. So I just kind of throw that back at you. Are we just going through this particular time? Is it a dearth in great directorial vision, attention to verse, or actually can Shakespeare see through all of the narrowing?
I was going to just, because we're running out of time, I think I'll ask Alka and Jane then to comment, and then if you could come back and make a big roundup, that would be great.
Well, I was going to say, speaks to what Richard was saying. I think you've answered your own question there, Richard. I mean, Shakespeare can survive anything, providing that he is approached with an open mind, with a sense of respect, but most importantly, attention to the language and an engagement with the kind of existential themes. Because that's the way, what we were talking about before you arrived, Andrew, was, you know, how some productions, they manage to make the language sing and seem so natural just in the way we're talking now. But, you know, surely as an actor, I'm not an actor, but I've acted in some Shakespeare plays. You know, you know that it's only when you have kind of really engaged in the emotional reality, the subjective truths of that work of art, that you can then appropriate the language and begin to speak it in your own way, which doesn't mean, you know, abandoning blank verse or the iambic pentameter, but it means being able to speak that naturally And that's when the plays and the themes, I think, are at their most powerful and potent. So as long as there is attention to that, I saw the Ray Fiennes play as well, and I have a very similar judgment on that as you, Andy. But I also saw a few years ago, and Jane, I don't know if you were there when we saw the Midsummer Night's Dream at the Bridge. That was, and that was it was kind of broadly interpreted as bringing a feminist reading to that play, but it was done so sensitively to the language, and it brought that one line to life that I had always missed before. Going back to what you were saying at the beginning, Jane, is that when Theseus says to Hippolyta, I won thee in war, but I shall woo thee in another manner, or something like that. And then at the end of the play, the actual staging and the way the staging is arranged so beautifully with the language that actually unfolds. You see that unfold, and they they end up in a kind of symmetry where before they were not symmetrical. So there's that idea of balance, there's that idea of equal respect, and so subtly done, so brilliantly done. So I mean, I think he can, but you've got to love the language. Whereas the Globe's recent ones are just appalling because they just it's nothing but message. It's nothing but their ideological message.
Jane.
Well, on the worst and best, and so interesting, the worst Shakespeare production I have seen was in the Globe just after COVID. So there may be some excuse, and it was The Tempest. And it was so boring and dull. I can't even remember anything about it, and it was a shame because I was bringing my oldest daughter. She's not as engaged in the cultural sphere as I might wish her to be, and so I was thinking, after COVID she's desperate to go and see something. We'll go and see The Tempest, and it was just dull. So it didn't even have any particular identity politics, I think, and you did feel that theatre really dislikes Shakespeare in that he's not even engaging in it. It's just making it dull. I think it sort of worked out. This is the way you kill Shakespeare, in a sense, in as you say, Richard, having no key to the language, but not interested. He felt they are not interested in this play, and that's quite an extraordinary feat to make The Tempest dull. I mean, you might and the best ones at the moment for me, mainly I now go and see, the very nice semi-professional theatre in Hyams Park that does a theatre in the park, and go down to Cambridge when they have the Cambridge Festival. So much more those sort of semi-professional, semi-amateur troupes, because they really still invested in Shakespeare. They obviously find great delight in it, great wonderment in it. And so actually for me now, they're much the productions I prefer than, you almost have to, when you're going to some of the big, more professional productions, you don't feel that happy. You don't think the people love it who are directing it and producing it, and it's not brilliant.
Andrew, final words.
Well, I think Jane's made a really interesting point about the people making Shakespeare not really loving Shakespeare. I think, was it Emma Rice, who was the artistic director of the Globe, who actually admitted to not really liking Shakespeare? And you would have thought she wouldn't have applied for that job if she didn't. And you get that sense from particularly the RSC and the Globe that they just don't like Shakespeare very much because they find him problematic. The Globe runs an annual anti-racist Shakespeare webinar where they kind of effectively act like moral detectives and point out why Shakespeare is so evil. I am taking a risk on the RSC because I'm going to go and see Othello next week. I have tickets for that. And I looked into that very carefully. It looked like the least ideological production they've got at the moment. And the actor who's playing Othello is a very very well reputable, established theatre voice. Someone who I'd like to think wouldn't participate in something that was bad. So fingers crossed, maybe that. And I think the director's done some good work. So I'm taking a risk on that. But yeah, that's the sort of key idea. I mean, when it comes back to Richard's point about whether Shakespeare, of course, people are going to talk about the issues of the day whenever they approach Shakespeare. And to an extent, that is true. But I suppose it's the difference between finding the relevance within Shakespeare to our own society and simply proselytizing, simply propagandizing, which I think that's quite a key distinction. And I fear that is what's happening now. If you go and see a show at the Globe, I mean, okay, put a suicide hotline number up above Romeo and Juliet, which they did, and that's fine. But it becomes bland and boring, and it becomes not what the play is. The play is not about teenage mental health. I mean, you can make it about that, and then like I say, you narrow it, and you become a propagandist, and you're just using this. And I think what the broader problem is, yes, I think Shakespeare can survive so long as the texts remain intact and people, the public, are able to read and interpret the texts. If the ideologues get their way, and which is why they are so obsessed with education, the idea of getting kids when they're young, people won't be able to read Shakespeare anymore because they will be simply seeing art and literature as through the lens of identity politics. Effectively, they will see Shakespeare as just a white man producing work to promote the interests of other white men. And they do. That's the way they see the world. So we have, I think, just in terms of education, we have to make sure that we don't have this kind of ideology within education. What we have is teaching children how to read and how to think. So that's where it won't survive, is if the ideologues get their way. But they won't, ultimately, they won't, because humankind is slightly more powerful than that, and every prevailing ideology falls eventually. So I'm not particularly worried about that. But yeah, and I think what you say about the language is so important. And the comparison between when you're talking about Peter Hall and Judi Dench and the people who actually love the language and love doing what they were doing, compared to, as you say, the sort of vandalism of Shakespeare that we see now, instead of people who just hate him, that makes all the difference, I think. And it's really important for the actors in particular to know what they're doing when it comes to the language, when it comes to what the meaning of the words, the multiplicity of the meaning of the words, the wordplay, the rhythms, the verse. And if the actors do the hard work and the directors do the hard work, the audience doesn't have to, insofar as we are become receptors to this kind of thing. I mean, we don't even notice, if we're watching Macbeth, how many audience members notice that the witches are speaking in a different verse form? They're not speaking in pentameter, they're speaking in tetrameter. But we don't sit there and think about that. But we do get a sense of this kind of fairy tale-like cadence. We get a sense of otherworldliness without necessarily knowing why. Similarly, you could take the sonnets, and if you look at the way the sonnets are structured, he's doing the Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnet form rather than the Italianate sonnet form, the Petrarchan sonnet form, because there's more rhymes in Italian. That's why you'd have to change it. But he still retains the structure of the Italian sonnet form. There's always normally a turn in the sonnet on the 9th line. So you end up with an octave and a sestet, which means that he's got the Shakespearean structure, but he's also got the old Italian structure built in thematically, and you don't really notice it. Obviously, if you're studying it and looking at it, you can see what he's doing there, how he's building in two layers of scaffolding into the one poem. But the effect it has on us as we read it or hear it is palpable, even if we don't really understand it. So I think absolutely it's got to be about the practitioners of Shakespeare and the love of the language and their willingness to engage in the language and to not just look for the moral flaws within the text. I think that's going to be absolutely key. But I'm glad you mentioned that element of language, because I think it's so important. I think not just in terms of when he switches from verse to prose, although sometimes that's key. I mean, if you think about Antony's incredible speech, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," it is a kind of revision and improvement on Brutus's speech, which occurs earlier in the scene, which is a prose speech. And so the shift to verse has many different effects. If you think about when Romeo and Juliet, the first words that Romeo and Juliet exchange, if you piece them together, it's a sonnet in a very strict form. Does that matter? Well, not when you're watching the play necessarily, but you do get a sense from it, and you get a feeling of why that matters. And even as Alka says, when kids don't understand the language, I mean, this, it's 400 years old. Of course, there's going to be elements where all of us, there are passages in Shakespeare that Shakespearean scholars don't fully understand. It doesn't matter, does it? Because it's poetry, ultimately, because it's poetry. And we have to come back to that point that poems aren't riddles to be solved. They are attempts through language to reach a transcendental truth. And if we approach them in that way, and if kids are taught to approach them in that way, and actors do the necessary homework to deliver them in that way, then I think it will last forever.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really brilliant. It's given me a whole new side of your personality, because your knowledge of Shakespeare is just sort of amazing. And I wish you'd been my teacher. Actually, I'd have sort of sustained my embraces Shakespeare much more consistently. I think it's been fantastic listening to you and everybody else. I thought it was a really interesting, useful discussion. So thanks all very much, Andrew, Richard, Jane, and Alka. See you next time, I guess.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Really enjoyable.